The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I hate that I have to do this next story, this first story today, but I'd be doing something wrong if I didn't. And it's about reaction to the Mueller report, which is not actually the Mueller report. And that reaction and coverage of the Barr report has been truly embarrassing. And I'm talking about reaction from media. I'm talking about reaction from many in the public. To just kind of get everybody up to speed again, we've not seen the Mueller report. Mitch McConnell and William Barr are already working hard to ensure that that full report is never actually seen by the House of Representatives nor by the public. I'll tell you more about that a little bit later today. All we have right now is a 4-page summary of a summary by Donald Trump's partisan Attorney General William Barr. And way too many people on the right and the left have abandoned logic and reason in their reactions and their responses. Now, of course, Donald Trump's reaction was exactly what we predicted, claiming total exoneration. That was written on the wall, tweeting, quote, "No collusion, no obstruction, complete and total exoneration, keep America great." We knew that this is what he would say. But just because Trump plays his predictable role doesn't mean everybody else has to throw critical thinking out the window, which unfortunately has taken place in many enclaves since this 4-page summary went public. Number one, it was too seldom mentioned in the constant coverage of this that we have not seen the Mueller report, okay? The reporting was all Mueller exonerates, Mueller clears, etc. What we had was a 4-page summary of a summary, as I told you yesterday. We are reacting to a partisan, selective, sanitized summary of Robert Mueller's summary of the investigation. Anybody in the media or on my Twitter or wherever who is pretending that this summary actually tells us what's in the investigation case file is actually damaging the eventual ability to evaluate what it is that Robert Mueller did and didn't find. Now, because of people on the right and left claiming that Donald Trump has now been exonerated, they have participated in priming the pump for a muted response to whatever the Mueller investigation actually found, if we ever find out the full scope of that investigation. If we ever see the actual findings of the Mueller investigation, imagine that they reveal, I don't know, Mueller had 80% of what he needed to say that Donald Trump obstructed justice, but wasn't able to establish it beyond a reasonable doubt. Everyone has already reported that the report clears the president, that this is now fake news if it says something that is different than what was reported after Barr's 4-page summary was published. Barr's letter isn't even written in coherent legalese, as I told you yesterday in detail. And there are people in corporate media and some in independent media, and of course in conservative media, and even in so-called left-wing media to some degree, saying the president has been cleared, an unqualified clearing exoneration of the president. Do the facts matter anymore? For everyone saying Trump didn't collude with Russia, but he's still corrupt, I mean, that's right. And this 4-page summary from his attorney general increasingly appears to be part of that corruption, as I explained to you yesterday. If the report can't exonerate Trump, which is what it says, if Mueller cannot exonerate Trump on obstruction, that's a very damning report. And to focus the reporting merely on the fact that Trump hasn't been caught personally colluding with Putin, which everybody has been saying for more than a year, including me, and I'll have video of that in a second, is missing the point of the story. It is straw manning. And the number of people who have contacted me on our subreddit, on Twitter, saying, David, you need to apologize because you were proven wrong on collusion. Was I? Take a look at this video from a year ago with what I specifically said about Donald Trump personally colluding.
Do you personally think that Donald Trump colluded with Russia? Like, just your personal thought.
as an
I
individual,
feel
like
like
that Trump personally was like talking to Putin and setting things up?
yeah, like do you think Putin installed some guy who doesn't know what he's doing in our government, and now he's just here, just
Well,
sitting
hold
there?
on. That's two different. Let's take them one at a time, if that's okay with you.
Okay.
All right. Question one is, do I think Trump was directly involved in coordination with Russian agents? I think the answer is probably no. I think that Trump was aware that his campaign was talking to Russian actors, but I think the likelihood of
Yeah,
Trump personally coordinating anything is probably close to zero.
that's good to hear.
Okay. Second part is, do I believe that Russia installed Trump? No, not in a literal sense. Russia clearly had an interest in Trump being the Republican nominee from a pretty early moment in the primary. Once he
Yeah.
became the nominee, Russia clearly had a preference for Trump over Hillary Clinton, and they had a number of different tools at their disposal to help Trump. So when we pretend that people said things that they didn't, whether it's me or anybody else, we also lose. So let's stop with that, because even people in our audience are embarrassing themselves on this issue. And then lastly, anyone pretending that this is over is really missing the boat, okay? The Southern District of New York is still investigating. Trump's inaugural has now been subpoenaed, totally separate from the Mueller probe. The Trump Organization is now under lawsuits for emoluments violations. The House Ways and Means Committee may well get Donald Trump's tax returns before we know it. But the criticism here isn't that I think Trump personally colluded with Putin. As you saw, I a year ago said I don't think that's the case. The problem is that every major news outlet and some non-major ones have capitulated or acquiesced in a way that is just not warranted by what we actually have so far, which is a summary of a summary from Trump's attorney general. Even if we grant Barr the most generous benefit of the doubt, and I don't know why we would, given his history of covering up presidential wrongdoing, this was a very cheap propaganda attempt by William Barr to summarize a summary in the most favorable possible way and use it as a data point to claim that there's been an exoneration. To every person in the media who played along with this over the last 72 hours, you're a part of the problem. And this confirms to everybody saying that the media is liberally biased. They're biased towards sensationalism and towards a coherent narrative. The real story here, the true one, is too complex of a narrative to make a good corporate media story. So instead, it's been probe for a year. Now it's exoneration wall to wall for the last 72 hours. And their coverage of all of it fell embarrassingly short. So now let's talk about the actual report, okay? Donald Trump's Attorney General William Barr is going to send the Robert Mueller report first to Donald Trump before the House of Representatives gets to look at it. This is according not to left-wing media, but according to a Republican senator named Lindsey Graham from South Carolina. It's going to work out perfectly, okay? Anything Donald Trump doesn't want being seen by the House and potentially made public, he can redact and claim executive privilege over. Lindsey Graham also now says that it's expected to take weeks to get a version of the Mueller report that would be acceptable to Trump to have made public, which is absolutely ridiculous. Congress should get the full unredacted report. They can analyze it. They can determine what is genuinely sensitive information in terms of national security. And the House of Representatives would be able to decide about its release. You could go to the FBI. The FBI would be a totally reasonable agency to consult about what is in the report that would actually pose a national security threat. It can't be up to Trump, okay? This is the continuation, sort of the next phase in what we can call a slow motion cover-up. Everything has been telegraphed in advance. The selection and the appointment of William Barr as Attorney General, who doesn't even believe a president can be charged with obstruction. The summary of a summary, carefully worded and published by William Barr. Weeks now for Donald Trump to pick and choose what he does and doesn't want released, and Trump's own Attorney General is going to allow Trump, who is the subject of the investigation, to redact the report about the investigation into him. Trump will get to edit the report before it goes public. Now, I'm not saying that no redactions would likely be necessary. If there are pieces of information in there that relate to intelligence assets or methods and sources, okay, for national security reasons, we should redact that. The FBI is well positioned to make that call. The House of Representatives is well positioned to make that call. If it relates to open investigations, which there are many at this point, okay, the FBI and the House can figure out what shouldn't be published. But Pat, you can't let the guy being investigated decide what does and doesn't get published about the investigation into him.
Yeah, it's called executive privilege, and it certainly is a privilege. Not only can Trump redact information, he also had the opportunity to fire people conducting the investigation over the past year and a half. Luckily, he didn't fire Mueller, but he could have. I guess our only recourse, if he does decide to do this, would be potentially the House subpoenaing the full report, or them calling Mueller and William Barr to testify before Congress. Would those testimonies be held in private or in public? Probably in private if there's a lot of national security information that's too sensitive to release. But yeah, we got to see the full report. I mean, come on, this is ridiculous.
The only hope is the White House is known to be so incompetent and inept that maybe they would mess up the redactions and not end up redacting everything that might actually give us a window into what the full scope of the investigation has been. Here's my call to you. Are any of the Trumpists in our audience willing to admit that Donald Trump redacting his own investigation is ridiculous? It's not transparent. It's not sensible. You don't need to tell me that you no longer support Trump. You don't need to tell me that you like Hillary Clinton or whoever. All I'm asking is, are there Trumpists out there who are willing to say it's not the right thing for Trump to redact the report into his own investigation? That's all I'm asking. Let me know. I'm on Twitter at @DPacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Wesley Horn. We are mostly funded by members like Wesley who have signed up on our website, www.joinpakman.com. Also want to say thanks to a longtime sustaining member, Jurian Vreeberg, who has now been a member for almost 5 years. Today's longtime sustaining member of the day. Wesley and Jurian, thank you for your support. You can use the coupon code THISIS2020 to save 40% off of your membership. Please sign up, folks. Please sign up. You'll feel good. It's the right thing to do if you like the show and can afford a couple of bucks a month. And it really makes a big difference to our revenue stream. Okay, it is time for this week's Hatriot Mail. Quick reminder about what Hatriot Mail is.
So what if the president's been accused of sexual harassment 15 times? Or that he paid hush money to a porn star? At least he never wore a tan suit. Hatriot Mail. Written by patriots who hate David Pakman. Because America. And because freedom.
New term, new vocabulary term, patriotic term that maybe would be well suited for an Urban Dictionary definition, introduced by this week's Hatriot Mail. Let's take a listen to it together.
David Pakman is a Jewish supremacist. Why don't you, along with the rest of the online clarions, talk about what really matters, with of the leveraging of money? Too deep for you just like it is for Trump? Or are you afraid of losing your show by pissing of the bankers back behind everything, whether with you or Trump?
Yeah, I might lose the show, not if I piss off the bankers, but if I piss of the bankers. And of course, the Hatriot Mail bingo word there is supremacist. I am a supremacist, very, very different thing than a supremacist, Jewish supremacist, which is, it's a really strange thing actually involving a bowling ball, but we'll probably have to save that for the bonus show. Send a middle finger salute to the Hatriots by using the coupon code Hatriot40, Hatriot 40. If you apply that coupon code to any membership on our website, whether it's $6 a month or $480 for the year or anything in between, the coupon code Hatriot40 saves you 40%, and it really infuriates the Hatriots to learn that their patriotism is only bolstering financial support for the show. So I recommend you take advantage of that sooner than later. We have news from Donald Trump's 2020 campaign. And the reason that it's news from the campaign instead of the administration has everything to do with the First Amendment. And I'll explain that to you in a second. I guess Trump sort of riding high on his own determination that he has been totally and completely exonerated by William Barr's summary of the Mueller investigation. Trump's campaign for re-election has published a memo to media outlets demanding that certain people be blacklisted. All of the people happen to be critics of Donald Trump. They sent out this memo with the subject line, credibility of certain guests. And they pointed out that there are people who have appeared on television throughout the course of Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation and said things that Donald Trump doesn't like. And what the Trump campaign is now asking of television producers is that they not invite these people back onto their programs. And they actually provide a list of people who should be blacklisted. That list includes Senator Richard Blumenthal. It includes Congressman Adam Schiff. By the way, I totally forgot to mention this. When I went to D.C. last weekend, I went to lunch at a particular place, and I turn around, and Adam Schiff is standing right behind me having a meal with someone. And if I told you what he ordered, you would all be shocked. No, I wasn't sitting close enough to see what he ordered, but he seemed to be enjoying it. Anyway, Congressman Adam Schiff, the Trump campaign, doesn't want invited back on programs. Congressman Gerald Nadler, Congressman Eric Swalwell, DNC Chair Tom Perez, former CIA Director John Brennan. The Trump 2020 campaign is directing news producers to not have these people on. And as they say, they want news producers to consider whether any of those people should be allowed back on the basis of having spread what they call incorrect information, which is hilarious because if news producers literally followed that, you can't have anybody on, or you shouldn't have anybody on, who has spread misinformation and disinformation. Everyone on Fox News would need to be fired immediately, and Trump himself wouldn't be allowed back on any programs. Now, this gets back to the First Amendment thing that I mentioned at the beginning of the segment. There's a reason why this letter was released by the Trump 2020 campaign rather than the Trump White House. It's so that they can't say that this is the government attempting to censor or control media. When the Trump campaign publishes this memo, they can say it's a recommendation from a political campaign. Okay, this is not government censoring or trying to censor any voices. If the Trump White House releases such a memo to media outlets, you correctly would get allegations that this is an instance of government trying to suppress people's speech, limit the freedom of press outlets to decide completely by themselves who they should and shouldn't have on. And that's a very specific reason why we are getting this from the 2020 Trump campaign rather than the Trump White House. Now, let me talk about a different type of censorship that's going on. I would actually direct media outlets, anytime you have a former Trump associate, whether it's from Trump's political administration, whether it's from Trump's business, whatever, we know that they are forced by Donald Trump to sign these oppressive non-disclosure agreements. So what I would like to see is anytime a current or former Trumpist is brought on to corporate media, say to them, have you signed a non-disclosure and or non-disparagement agreement that limits what you're allowed to say today? Because knowing that would actually be the responsible thing for media to do. Are you able to say whatever you want today, or are you limited by a non-disclosure or a non-disparagement agreement with any Trump-affiliated entity? And if the answer is yes, then we should all understand that they are bound by a legal document restricting their speech, which Donald Trump made them sign. I don't think we're going to see that, and hopefully we're also not going to see media outlets bow to this request from the Trump campaign. It's chilling. It's yet another one of these authoritarian tendencies. And I think that, as usual, Pat, it's another instance of projection. Everything that the Trump administration accuses others of, in this case, media interviewing people who spread disinformation. I mean, turn on Fox and Friends. That's all it is.
Yeah, and if you take a look at the list of names, they also have quotes attributed to them, and these quotes are apparently reasons why they should not be invited back on news programs, and they're totally lackluster. Like the one for Adam Schiff, it says, "I think there's plenty of evidence of collusion or conspiracy in plain sight." First of all, he says, "I think," right? So he's expressing his opinion there. And second, I mean, evidence of collusion in plain sight, you could attribute that to the Trump Tower meeting, right? I mean, we, for a long time, have been talking about whether this is collusion that rises to the degree of conspiracy to defraud the United States, and that would be a big charge. Ultimately, we didn't get that from the Mueller report, but to say that what Adam Schiff said was totally wrong there, that's just not true.
Completely uncontroversial comment from Adam Schiff. There is evidence of collusion plain as day. He's not saying that that is criminal collusion. He is saying that that's what he sees and that's what he believes. And I mean, can you imagine saying someone can't be allowed back on media or shouldn't be allowed back on media outlets because they expressed their very sensible opinion on the basis of what was publicly known at the time? And by the way, my last thought on this, I've been pushing, asking, imploring the press corps, the White House press corps, to hold Sarah Huckabee Sanders to the standard that apparently now the Trump campaign wants Democratic elected officials held to by corporate media. Sarah Huckabee Sanders is the one who actually should be scrutinized in the way that it appears the 2020 Trump campaign is demanding media outlets do of Democratic and other anti-Trump forces. I guess this ultimately comes down to Donald Trump is feeling sort of audacious, riding high on the emotion of William Barr's bogus 4-page letter, which Trump claims or actually believes fully exonerates him, and hopefully no media outlets will actually follow through with this. The David Pakman Show is on Instagram at David Pakman Show. Follow us there. Back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to welcome to the program today Robert Hockett, who is a professor of law and finance at Cornell University. He is an advisor to Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, also one of the architects of the Green New Deal. And so the timing of our interview is actually very good in a sense, because yesterday the Senate voted on taking up the Green New Deal. And of course, we know that many Democrats in the Senate support a lot of the ideas that are in the plan. But there was the perception, probably accurately, that Republicans are sort of trying to score political points by forcing a vote on a proposal that is still more of an overview, an aspirational document. So what's your reaction to so many Democrats voting present yesterday?
Yeah, so this is actually quite familiar, David. Mitch McConnell does this a lot. He did it this time last year in connection with another initiative that the Democrats have been behind. What he essentially does is, as a kind of a stunt, he'll bring something up for a vote, even though there's been absolutely no discussion of it yet within the chamber or either of the chambers of Congress, for that matter. There have been no committee hearings. There's been no sort of process. Just sort of out of the blue, right? He just sort of calls it up for a vote. Apparently, the hope is that, if he catches everybody by surprise like this, they won't vote for it. They'll vote against, or some will for and some against, and then it'll lose. And then he'll be able to say, oh, it lost. But the Democrats are on to this particular tactic of his, and they have been for a long time. So what they do every time that he announces an intention to pull this particular stunt again is they all agree actually just to vote present, but not to vote yay or nay, in order to sort of signal to the broader public that this isn't a real vote and it wasn't ever meant to be a real vote. So they've effectively just called his bluff again this time, like last time. The people over at Fox News and other right-wing media, they're well aware of this. They've seen this happen a million times before, but then they try to use the present vote as if it were a no vote, or as though it signaled some sort of disarray or disagreement within the ranks about the merits of the Green New Deal in this case, or Medicare for All last year, or other initiatives before that. Nobody who actually knows about legislative process ever falls for that. It's just a lie.
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of people don't know about legislative process. And so it's still sort of effective headlines of Democrats vote against their own Green New Deal when, as you mentioned, voting present is not voting for or against. But in a sense, you know, the sort of cynicism that we have about this and the predictability that they would do this, it still works, and it still works for a significant portion of the sort of media consumer base. So what's next? In other words, what's the next step with this Green New Deal?
Yeah, so as you suggested at the outset, what we have at the moment is a resolution. The resolution is best thought of as a kind of opening gavel. It's meant to sort of open a national conversation or a national discussion about how best to address the now existentially threatening climate crisis on the one hand, and the sort of profound economy-threatening infrastructural degradation and manufacturing degradation of the country on the other hand. We chose the name New Deal, sort of, or the component of the Green New Deal name that is the New Deal component, quite deliberately. The original New Deal, which a lot of people either are too young to remember because they weren't around or just never read the history of, was itself never one enactment. It was never one particular legislative action or statute or resolution or what have you. It was an organic process that unfolded over the course of a decade or more. It was basically constituted by a sequence of distinct statutory measures, each one building upon its predecessors, and each one passed only after lively national discussion at the national level, at the state level, at the local levels, even at the neighborhood levels, at every step along the way. So what that means at present is that the resolution that was introduced by Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez on the one hand and Senator Markey on the other at the very beginning of February was simply the initiation of that same process this time around. That then takes us to your more immediate question, which is, okay, well, what comes next? Probably what will happen next is that somebody, either the Congresswoman or the Congresswoman acting with some of her colleagues, or Senator Markey acting with colleagues in the Senate, or some group of senators and House members alike, will try to figure out what single discrete enactment should be the first enactment to be made. What they'll probably do is focus on something that Democrats and Republicans alike can get behind, given that, you know, we don't have majorities in both houses of Congress and the White House yet. That seems especially important. Although, to be quite frank, we would like to do all of this in a bipartisan way, even once we have massive majorities in both houses, and even when we have the White House again. So what does that mean? I suspect, again, infrastructure or manufacturing will probably be at the core of the first one or two enactments. We'll probably try to do it. We'll probably try to replicate yet another feature of the original New Deal in doing this, and that is to see to it that whatever projects are undertaken are meant to be undertaken in literally every congressional district of the country, so that literally everybody benefits. That was another sort of marvelous feature of the original New Deal that people either have forgotten or never knew. One reason that the New Deal was so popular, even among Republicans, was precisely because the New Deal had projects in literally every congressional district of the country, meaning that literally everybody would benefit. And that's not just, of course, politically savvy, which it is, but it's much more than that. We think it's just democracy, right? Or it's justice. If the Green New Deal is meant to be for everybody, well, then, of course, it makes sense for its projects as a total portfolio to operate to the benefit or for the benefit of everybody.
And Robert, one of the criticisms of the bill or the proposal, the initial proposal, that I think are more interesting, more worthy of discussion than the sort of cartoonish ones that we sort of, I don't think, really need to delve into it in detail, is that some of the particular timelines that were generally outlined in the original 14-page resolution were unrealistically optimistic. So I guess my question for you is a two-part question. One, do you agree with that assessment? But more importantly, does that matter if this is just creating sort of an initial framework for what the end goals are?
So I think it's actually false. I think everything about the resolution, everything that's in the resolution is actually quite feasible and quite doable. I also, though, do take your point that in a certain sense it doesn't matter, because really the idea here is if you swing for the fences, as they say, if you try to hit it out of the park, you're all the more likely to hit a home run, even if it doesn't go all the way out of the park, right? Even if it only reaches the stands or only reaches, the far wall or something, you're much more likely to reach that far wall if indeed you are swinging for the proverbial fences. So in that sense, it wouldn't matter if they weren't, completely feasible goals. But that being said, right, it wouldn't be plausible to suggest that we do something that's completely on its face unrealistic, even as a way of getting people to sort of aspire for more and to sort of swing for the fences and thereby not quite make it to the fences. There needs to be some degree of feasibility, or at least some plausibility to the stated end goal, in order for people even to bother to try to get to it in a manner that then might fall slightly short or might fall far short. So maybe needless to say then, given that, we actually do think the particular goals are quite feasible. This is America, after all, and we are a can-do country. At least that used to be a big part of our culture. That used to be probably maybe one of the 2 or 3 most fundamental sort of constitutive elements of our culture. Is we were a can-do people. You and I are perhaps old enough to remember the old phrase American know-how. You don't hear people dropping that phrase or using those words as often as you and I probably did when we were kids, but it's still a thing, right? The idea of American know-how and the idea of America as a can-do country. And it's worth noting that there's not a single extraordinary thing that this country has done in its well over 200-year history now that wasn't deemed or sort of denounced as implausible or crazy when first propounded, right?
That's fair, but let me just give a couple specifics. I mean, and again, to be clear, these are not things that I think are bad ideas, but when, for example, we look at 10 years to go to net zero greenhouse gas emissions and upgrade all existing federal buildings, I of course agree with doing that. I just don't see any way that that happens in 10 years, even if we start today.
Yeah, I guess I don't see why it couldn't happen. You know what I mean? We could, if we mobilize the resources and we mobilize the population, I don't see any reason that we can't do that. It's worth noting, just by way of specific example, right? When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and it was clear now that we were going to have to get into the Second World War, President Roosevelt called a bunch of industrial leaders into the White House and said, what can you do when it comes to producing bombers and tanks and other kinds of war material? What are we producing now? And is the following goal a realizable goal? The goal that he put before them was something like 10 times what we were then producing. And they said, well, we might be able to double present production, or we might be able to triple, but 10 times, that's just not possible. And he said, let's make it 11. And they did it. They did it quite straightforwardly, right? Because they were serious about it. And one of the things that we're trying to argue here is that the climate change problem on the one hand, and the continued degradation of the nation's infrastructure and manufacturing base on the other hand, are in a sense the moral equivalent of war, right? They're just as important. Indeed, in many ways, they're even more important, because they're a much more, I think, immediate existential threat to the continental United States, even than the Japanese threat was after the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
One of the more practical questions, you mentioned it makes sense to start with what Democrats and Republicans could agree upon doing, and I completely agree with you on that. My concern is I also agree with you that something related to infrastructure is probably that thing. The problem I see with it is that every proposal for infrastructure spending from the current president has been a crony capitalist handout to his buddies, effectively. So I guess from a practical perspective, when the Republicans continue to control the Senate and the White House, is the only thing that could happen an infrastructure plan that is one of those crony capitalist handouts? And if not, how do you get around it and get Republicans to support it?
Yeah. So I think that the easiest way to get around this is just to say, look, here is a realistic infrastructure proposal.
Yeah.
You, Mr. Trump, ran on infrastructure. You claimed that it mattered to you and that it was important to you. We're not willing to turn this into some kind of a crony capitalist boon simply for your pocketbook. You've got enough emoluments already coming from the various other violations of the emoluments clause that you're engaged in. We're not willing to do it with infrastructure. So here are your options, right? Infrastructure without cronyism, or no infrastructure. My guess is that Republicans in Congress and ultimately Mr. Trump himself probably don't want to be characterizable by the media as the people who turned down any kind of infrastructural reform or revitalization simply because they couldn't personally profit from it.
You know, I'm not sure about that, because look at what's happened with the wall, right? I mean, Mexico was going to pay for it, and it was going to fill the entire U.S.-Mexico border. I guess my thought is, it doesn't seem that the Trump base is going to hold him accountable for failing to do any of the things that he promised. So I almost wonder if he would just turn it down if it's not infrastructure the way he wants to do it.
So you might be right, David, that his base might not. I mean, his base seemed to be almost like religious converts or something, such that they'll come up with some way to explain away nearly any wrong that he commits. But I think the one thing where we tend to overlook these days, and I can understand why, because it's sort of an unpleasant thought that this might even be true, but sizable numbers of people who would have voted for Bernie Sanders had he been the Democratic nominee voted for Trump, right? There is, in other words, a swing vote here.
What's your evidence for that? Because what I've seen is that a statistically insignificant number of Bernie primary supporters ultimately voted for Trump. Where are you getting that?
Yeah, so most of the data that I've heard about or read about is that it's much more than a statistically insignificant number of people, particularly if you think in terms of those who also simply refrained from voting rather than voting for Trump.
Ah, okay, that's fair, but that's a different assertion.
It is, but again, the point is, if you can mobilize large numbers of people who did not vote against Trump because they were troubled about Clinton's being the nominee, if you can mobilize those folk, including the Bernie supporters, to get out there and say, look, yeah, we're definitely going to get active again, and then active in a very anti-Trumpian way, if we have to sacrifice infrastructural revitalization just because the president wouldn't allow it to be done unless he could personally profit from it, my guess is that that's a pretty effective pitch. And even the diehard base of Trump supporters do not constitute anything even remotely resembling a majority of voters in this country.
I hope that you're right, and we will be paying attention to it very, very closely. We've been speaking with Professor Robert Hockett, who is a professor of law and finance at Cornell University, advisor to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, one of the architects of the Green New Deal proposal. Robert, really a pleasure having you on today.
Thanks so much, David. Great to be on with you.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
For the last, year or more, we've followed Rudy Giuliani's constant missteps as Donald Trump's public attorney. He would show up and say, oh, the quote that I attributed to the president was a hypothetical quote, or I'm still getting up to speed on things, or this thing never happened, never happened. And then all of a sudden he says, well, yeah, of course it happened, but it's not a crime. And after these constant missteps, we saw Rudy pulled from public media appearances. He completely disappeared from television in his role as a defender of Donald Trump for months. And we actually addressed that during audience questions a couple of weeks ago. Rudy Giuliani has now reappeared. Apparently, once the Barr report came out, once William Barr's summary of Robert Mueller's summary of Mueller's investigation, once that came out, maybe the Trump people felt that Rudy would not be able to do more damage now that Trump has been, quote, exonerated. So Monday night, Rudy Giuliani shows up at Fox News. He appears on the Sean Hannity program, and he bizarrely, out of left field, claims that Robert Mueller was paid $30 million to run the Russia investigation, which is obviously untrue. But it's also ridiculous. Like, anyone who knows what federal government jobs pay would immediately recognize that $30 million for 2 years, the only way you're getting $30 million in 2 years out of the federal government is if you're a weapons contractor selling the missiles that can be used to kill people overseas. You're not getting $30 million by running an investigation. That's for sure. In any case, here is Rudy Giuliani making the claim to Sean Hannity, and of course Hannity not refuting it.
Then Barr and Rosenstein kind of knocked the obstruction thing right out of the park. No,
well, Mueller did is hand it back to Rosenstein, and
well, because the guy got paid somewhere upwards of $30 million, but he couldn't make the key decision. His hands were shaking. He probably had, he had Jekyll and Hyde. He had the bad guys and the good guys.
So reports are that Mueller's salary was $162,000 per year based on the federal government schedule of salaries that he would be entitled to based on experience. But Rudy makes the claim and Hannity doesn't correct him. And, what is true is that Robert Mueller was reportedly making more than $3 million at the D.C. law firm that he left in order to run this probe, which is pretty interesting. And this is how the circle of BS goes, okay? Rudy says it, Sean Hannity doesn't refute it, and now Trump or whoever can say, people say Mueller was paid $30 million to do this thing, which is, of course, ridiculous. Donald Trump is president of the United States. He can find out how much Robert Mueller was actually paid by the federal government, but it perpetuates the circle of disinformation. They'll then imply that the $30 million was some kind of a bribe so that Mueller would come to some particular conclusion, which, of course, if true, has completely backfired since Mueller punted to William Barr, at least on the issue of obstruction of justice by Donald Trump. So what's missing in terms of the finances of this investigation is that the costs of the investigation do appear to have been about $20 million. I have no particular reason to not believe that, but the investigation has recovered more than $40 million. In other words, the investigation made money. The investigation ran a surplus, which we can't say about Donald Trump's federal government, despite the numerous promises that he made. So bottom line, I see this, Pat, as indicative that people on the Trump side are still very worried about the contents of the report. So they have to continue to malign Robert Mueller. Because remember, Mueller could not exonerate Trump from obstruction. Remember, all we have is a political summary of a summary. And if this were really the end, they wouldn't still be going out there and attacking and smearing Robert Mueller.
Well, first of all, I think it's good to see Rudy Giuliani out of detention because I think he was producing a segment for us just about every week. So good to have him back. Also, even if the investigation did cost $20 million and there wasn't anything recovered from it, that would be totally fine as an investment. Like the federal budget each year is about $3 trillion. Usually when we talk about government expenditures, we're talking about something in the neighborhood of billions of dollars. $20 million for a 2-year investigation, that's just a drop in the bucket.
Yeah, and what's important to mention also is that a lot of the people that were working, so Pat makes a good point, which is if crimes have taken place and you get 37 indictments and people are held accountable for things that they did, you don't have to turn a profit on the investigation, right? Government doesn't have to turn a profit on everything it does. This is sort of like, do we not want police investigating murders if those investigations aren't going to be profitable? No, of course not. If wrongdoing has taken place, it should be done anyway. But there's a really additional good point to make about the cost of the investigation. Part of what's being included in that cost are the salaries of people working in the investigation. A lot of those people would be working earning similar or identical salaries just in other departments. So it's not even new spending. And I don't even know if it's worth going into this because the right just doesn't care, right? I mean, they'll use anything to say the investigation was a sham or a farce or a witch hunt. But this is also just moving around money that a lot of those investigators would have made anyway, just from other departments. I guess we don't even really need to go into it too much further. But a key point that I do want to make here, you simultaneously have people who are claiming that the investigation was a sham from the get-go, but that Mueller's conclusions, as summarized by William Barr, are accurate and believable. So let me kind of go into detail about what I mean by that. You've had people on the right who have said from the beginning, Mueller's appointment was illegal. The entire thing is a political witch hunt. Mueller can't be trusted. Mueller should be fired. The investigation is filled with anti-Trump Democrats. Mueller was paid $30 million to run the investigation. Mueller had it in for Trump. Mueller's a partisan actor who is discredited and dishonest. But then all of a sudden, when William Barr says, here's my summary of the work that Mueller did, they accept it. They accept Mueller's conclusion as summarized by William Barr, that there was no collusion. They accept William Barr's conclusion that on the basis of Mueller's probe, it doesn't make sense to charge Trump with obstruction, which, by the way, is not what Mueller said. It's what Barr has decided to do. How can you simultaneously have maligned Mueller's investigation for 2 years in every way, shape, and form, but now say, here's what Mueller says happened, and we completely trust it, synthesized, of course, through William Barr's political lens? Doesn't really make sense. Your partisanship is showing very, very clearly. Okay, extremely surprising and weird news. Prosecutors have dropped charges against actor Jussie Smollett for the homophobic hate crime that he was accused of having staged. I'll catch you up if you haven't followed the story. It's a very interesting and disturbing story. We covered it at the sort of beginning. Actor Jussie Smollett claimed to have been attacked by 2 white men. And later, as the details started to sort of fall apart, including that Smollett had been on the phone with the alleged attackers hours before the incident, he was arrested and he was charged with multiple felonies related to staging the attack, falsely reporting crimes. And it looked really, really bad. Prosecutors said at first that Smollett, who is black and gay, arranged for these 2 men that he knew to attack him on the basis that they were anti-black, anti-gay, and I guess Trump supporters. I think there was like a Make America Great, some kind of MAGA thing involved in the attacks as well. And it seemed really clear that that's what had happened, that this had been a staged, fake hate crime. What we learned yesterday is that prosecutors have abruptly dropped the charges in exchange for letting the city keep Smollett's $10,000 in bail and doing some community service, which according to one report, he may have already done or is about to do. Smollett is insisting, I guess, that he really was attacked, that the story, as he initially told it, was accurate. And prosecutors have not been clear about why they have all of a sudden abandoned this case. We heard from a spokeswoman for the Cook County Prosecutor's Office who said that they made the decision to dismiss the case after, quote, reviewing all of the facts and circumstances of the case. We had 16 felony counts here, but the most important thing, I think, in interpreting what happened is that this is sort of a deal, okay? This is not, he didn't do anything, period. This is a deal to drop the charges in exchange for Smollett agreeing to let the city keep his bail and doing community service. These are not significant penalties, I'm being clear about that, but he now gets to claim that he told the truth all along. But this is a deal that was reached, and that is not being fully reported by some of the media outlets that are talking about this. Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel says this is a, quote, whitewash of justice and is not pleased. Attorneys don't understand what's going on. Again, they say this is a deal of some kind. Normally, you would include in such a deal that Smollett apologizes for what he did or something like that. But that is not what is going on here. And it was considered that prosecutors even knew why Smollett allegedly staged this attack. He felt he was underpaid on the show Empire, on which he acts. He felt that if he staged this anti-gay, racist attack on himself, he would ultimately get more money from the people who employ him at Empire. And everything about this, Pat, is absolutely bizarre. And I would also add, if he now is maintaining that the attack was real, what's going on with the search for the perpetrators?
Yeah, this story was weird from the get-go, and it's just gotten even weirder. I guess because prosecutors have decided to drop the charges, now you have to reconsider whether or not he did stage the attack. I mean, there would be a lot to answer then, like, did he actually pay the 2 supposed perpetrators? How come those supposed perpetrators were connected to the show Empire? Like, I mean, all signs point to him staging the attack still, but just the sudden drop of charges, it's totally weird. And the fact that he's able to stay indignant about it, that he doesn't have to apologize, that he doesn't have to admit guilt in exchange for the deal, very weird.
It may come down to the charges were dropped because he has really good high-priced attorneys that a lot of people can't afford, and they were able to make this happen. Practical question is what happens to his role on Empire now? Does he get it back? I don't really care. I've never seen the show, but if the reason for the firing was that he staged the crime, now that he no longer has to admit to that or is not going to be prosecuted for that, does he then get the job back because the pretense of the firing has now been canceled out? I don't know, and it's extraordinarily unusual stuff. I have some very interesting voicemails to play for you today. Our voicemail number is 219-2-DAVID-P. The voicemail line sponsored by our friends over at Linguist, which is an artificial intelligence-based language learning service, which I've been using to improve my French. And I'm impressed with myself. I know some people in the audience won't be shocked to hear about that, but I'm patting myself on the back for how well I'm doing with my French learning. Thanks to Linguist, which lets you really improve in a short amount of time. You can try it for free, no credit card needed. Linguist.com/Pacman. That's Linguist with a V.com/Pacman. Okay, I have two voicemails for you today. They both relate to my interview with Natalie Wynn from ContraPoints that we aired for you over the last couple of days. I really wasn't sure whether to play these voicemails for you, and there are more than just these two, because they're disgusting transphobic voicemails. But I thought it important to play them for you because this is the right which claims to be against identity politics, playing identity politics. These are examples of people on the right disgustingly saying, I don't care what Natalie Wynn had to say because of her identity as a trans woman. First is the horribly racist Kansas troll who comes back out of the woodwork to be transphobic on the show. Take a listen.
Yo, Dave. I can't believe it. You finally did it, man. You have 3 trannies on the show at one time. It's not just you and Patrick anymore. You have this freak thing that you invited for an interview. And this thing that calls itself Natalie is totally mentally ill. I don't know why you call she or he or Natalie, because it's obviously a dude. Like, it's a dude.
Yeah. As you can tell, no criticisms at all of the very good information that Natalie laid out about fascism and authoritarianism. Also, Jimmy from Philly, a rabid Trump supporter, calling in about the same thing.
David, this is Jimmy from Philly. This is regarding the Natalie Wynn ContraPoints interview. You got to be kidding me. You got to be kidding me. This proves you're so disingenuous. Why don't you describe this person masquerading as a woman as a man? Because that's the truth, David. This is a person that is a man masquerading as a woman.
Yeah. Disgusting. And as you can tell, not able to refute the arguments, so you go ad hominem. And by the way, ad hominem about something that, I mean, listen, when guests appear on the program to talk about economics, we don't talk about their gender. When guests appear on the program to talk about fascism, we don't talk about their gender. And this unrealistic and disgusting identity politics that a lot of people on the right responded with to my interview with Natalie, really depressing. But I think it is important not to hide from the audience the fact that this was a significant portion of the reaction from the right about what I thought was a really informative interview. We've got a great bonus show for you today. Get instant access to the bonus show by becoming a member at www.joinpacman.com or a patron at patreon.com/David Pacman Show.
The David Pacman Show at davidpacman.com.